So we're still in Daniel 10 through 12. We are on the same outline that I had last week, or 2 days ago, 4 days ago. Notes on Daniel's last vision, Daniel 10 through 12. Did anybody do any more work in Daniel over the weekend? Maybe read through it, read some of the web pages. Anybody do anything?
No.
Oh, totally on my own, stumbling in the dark here. Okay.
Well, you're talking to somebody that got up yet a Sunday morning, didn't think it was Sunday, looked and said, oh my Lord, my doctor's appointment's at noon. And I rushed out the door into the car and I wondered, well, why is Kara and Chris' car gone? And I got halfway to Ocean Park and I realized, you idiot, it's Sunday.
Yeah, so this is one of the reasons why they're trying to get rid of, trying to eliminate daylight savings, because some people think it's a whole day that you skip forward. So.
Thank you for that, dear.
Yeah,
made me feel ever so much better.
Well, it's okay. The other thing people forget is that when it goes back, that there's 2 Sundays in a row on that weekend. But
but I saw on Facebook, and I know it must be true.
Must be true.
Right on.
That they had a really tough night, Saturday night at Stonehenge, moving all those rocks one space forward.
Oh, I love that. I hadn't seen that.
Yes.
Can't you just visualize that?
Yeah.
I can.
Well, they had a picture of them doing it and everything, so.
Oh, if you kept that, forward it to me, will you?
Sure, if I find it again. You know how things like that disappear.
Oh, it's too funny.
All right, so Daniel 10 through 12. So it's Daniel's last vision. Just going to give a quick overview of what we talked about on Thursday. So this is Daniel's last vision. The introduction to the vision comprises all of chapter 10. And if we look at chapter 10, verse 14, that's an important verse for understanding what the vision is about. The angel says to Daniel, now I have come to explain to you what will happen to your people in the future, for the vision concerns a time yet to come. Some translations, more literal, say what will happen to your people in the latter days. And maybe
That's
today so maybe today we'll look at what the latter days are. But I wonder if I have those. I had those passages written down somewhere. I think it's here. Yeah. All right. So the subject of the vision is what the angel has just summarized for Daniel. It's what will happen to Daniel's people in the latter days. That's important to realize because some of the pronouns are very hard to figure out who they're referring to as we go through it, as you noticed. And at a critical place in chapter 11, verse 36, lots of people lose the train of thought because of a new pronoun shows up and a new king looks like shows up. It says, the king will do as he pleases. And chapter 11, verse 36. And that's where I had mentioned that some interpreters think that's maybe still Antiochus IV, and then they try to fit history into it. It doesn't quite fit, and so they kind of manipulate the facts to make it fit. Some other interpreters think it might be one of the Caesars that's being talked about there, and so they try to make it fit Caesar. And I think they've got a good instinct there. I think, they're looking for contemporary events that follow in the historical succession that chapter 11 has been giving us. Other interpreters, probably the majority view in our day, is that chapter 11, verse 36 skips ahead 2,000 or more years to the future Antichrist. And the justification for that, there's a couple of justifications for skipping ahead to the future Antichrist. And one of them is that those verses, chapter 11, 36 and forward, don't describe Antiochus anymore. and they don't describe any first century character that the people, well, not first century, but contemporary character. So we're talking about probably around between 200 BC and the first century. In that period of time where people look and they say, well, we can't find anybody that fits these verses, so it must be something in the future. And then they say, well, it sounds like descriptions that Paul uses to talk about the man of sin and things like that. So they equate the person being spoken of in chapter 11:36 and forward with the future Antichrist. And I don't know, my purpose in going through these passages is because there's a reference in Revelation 10 that brings us back to this passage, and we looked at that reference last week. So I had started to go through the passage, chapter 11, verse by verse, and then I had skipped ahead to verse 36 and started talking about that. But I think probably it might be best to just real quickly go through the rest of chapter 11. So we'll pick up in verse 11, because I think we got through verse 10 there. So we're in Daniel 11:11, and my purpose this morning is to get us at least up through verse 36 so that we can feel the weight of the problem when we get to verse 36. So if you have your cheat sheet, which is the ESV notes that I sent you, and you can use your own study Bible notes if you want. They should all say the same thing, maybe using different words, but the same thing in at least verses 1 through 36. There's almost unanimous agreement on what these verses are referring to. So verse 11, then the king of the south will march out in a rage and fight against the king of the north, who will raise a large army, but it will be defeated. When the army is carried off, the king of the south will be filled with pride and will slaughter many thousands, and yet he will not remain triumphant. For the king of the north will muster another army larger than the first, and after several years he will advance with a huge army fully equipped. Those verses talk about the battles between Ptolemy IV, who would be the king of the south, and south is Egypt, king of the south, Ptolemy IV, and Antiochus III, and kind of just gives an overview of those battles. Now, Antiochus III is Syrian, and in the early part of Daniel 11, the king of the north is the Syrian king. Later, Rome conquers Syria, and the king of the north becomes the Roman king or Caesar or general.
Who was that first one? I'm sorry, Chuck, I didn't get the name.
The first one. Yeah, so the first one is Ptolemy the Fourth.
How do you spell that?
Well, I spell it Ptolemy.
Okay, I know who he is.
Yeah.
And he was from where?
So the Ptolemies are from Egypt.
Egypt, okay.
So he's the king of the south.
South and north, okay.
So you just need to train yourself when you're reading this. When you see south, you say Egypt, and north is Syria.
Syria, okay.
And the kings of the north and the kings of the south, they're always called either the kings of the north or the kings of the south, even though they might be a different king, because this goes through several hundred years of history. So we've already gone through, out the period of Alexander the Great and all of the Persian kings and all of that, and now we're down into this period between the Testaments. And so verse 14, in those times, many will rise against the king of the south. Who's the south?
Egypt.
Good. Okay. Egypt. Very good. The violent men among your own people will rebel in fulfillment of the vision, but without success. This is an interesting passage. Josephus tells us that at this time the Maccabees arose, and they actually wanted to frustrate the vision of basically this entire vision is about armies traipsing back and forth across Judea, and it's battles for control of the area. And Judea is a land bridge, and so you get armies going back and forth, and that the Maccabeans at this point wanted to stop the traipsing around and frustrate the fulfillment of this Daniel 11 vision. And so they rose up and they called themselves the violent men, which is what they're called here in the passage. They called themselves the violent men, and they had no success, which is what it says here. So that was at this time. Later on, the Maccabees rise up again and have a little more success. Verse 15, then the king of the north, Syria, will come and build up siege ramps and will capture a fortified city. The forces of the south will be powerless to resist. Even their best troops will not have strength to stand. And the invader will do as he pleases. No one will be able to stand against him. We are now talking about Antiochus IV, the Syrian king, Antiochus IV. He's Antiochus Epiphanes. He is really famous for trying to pretty much exterminate the Jewish faith. Later on, it's going to talk about him a little bit more. But when people talk about an Old Testament abomination of desolation, they're referring to this period of time that we're now entering, where the Syrian king tries to, as I said, exterminate the Jewish faith, burns all the copies of the scriptures, desecrates the temple, slaughters a pig on the altar, puts his own statue or the statue of his god in the temple, all kinds of really great things. And this phrase, to do as he pleases, in verse 16, comes up also in relation to Alexander the Great in verse 3, and then the mystery king in chapter 11, verse 36. And to do as you pleases doesn't mean that they're, actually, I'll just say what it means. What it means is they have great success in whatever they undertake. They have great success. So starting with verse 16 again, the invader will do as he pleases, and no one will be able to stand against him. He will establish himself in the beautiful land and will have the power to destroy it. He will determine the beautiful land is Judea, Israel. He will determine to come with the might of his entire kingdom and make an alliance with the king of the south. And he will give him a daughter in marriage in order to overthrow the kingdom, but his plans will not succeed or help him. So the daughter here, I believe, is Cleopatra. So Cleopatra is actually the daughter of Antiochus II, but Antiochus II gives Cleopatra in marriage to one of the Ptolemies. So Cleopatra is Syrian, given to an Egyptian king. And the purpose of doing that was so that the Egyptian king would gain some control over, so the Syrian king would gain some control over Egypt. Right? So Cleopatra is sent in there as an emissary of Syria, basically to manipulate the Egyptian king and to favor Syria, bring more power to Syria. Cleopatra, though, defies her father and sides with the Egyptians, sides with her husband. So this produces some problem there. That's what it means that he will give him a daughter in marriage in order to overthrow the kingdom, but his plans will not succeed or help him. Then he will turn his attention to the coastlands and will take many of them, but a commander will put an end to his insolence, and he will turn his insolence back upon him. After this, he will turn back toward the fortresses of his own country, but will stumble and fall to be seen no more. I'm sorry. So I have to correct myself. I said in verse 16 that the invader was Antiochus IV, but it's Antiochus II. Sorry about that. When we get to Antiochus IV, it'll be a little more violent than that. His successor will send out a tax collector to maintain the royal splendor. In a few years, however, he will be betrayed, yet not in anger or in battle. You have the notes there, I think. I think I have the notes too. Yeah, it just has, the notes just have the name of the tax collector, and it refers us to 2nd Maccabees. We're not going to go there right now. Verse 21, he will be succeeded by a contemptible person. Sorry, now we're to Antiochus IV, contemptible person who has not been given the honor of royalty. He will invade the kingdom when its people feel secure, and he will seize it through intrigue. Then an overwhelming army will be swept away before him. Both it and a prince of the covenant will be destroyed. After coming to an agreement with him, he will act deceitfully, and with only a few people he will rise to power. When the richest provinces feel secure, he will invade them and will achieve what neither his father nor his forefathers did. He will distribute plunder, loot, and wealth among his followers. He will plot the overthrow of fortresses, but only for a time. So let's look at, if you have the notes, I'm on page 3 right now, looking at the notes. And up at verse 21, the contemptible person is Antiochus IV. He wasn't the legitimate successor of his brother, since Seleucus IV had a son. And that's what it means. Verse 21, he will be succeeded by a contemptible person who has not been given the honor of royalty. He was not legitimately the successor, but he has usurped the power there. And he goes through and deceitfully gains power and also through military strength. Verse 25, when with a large army he will stir up his strength and courage against the king of the south, which would be Egypt again, king of the south. The king of the south will wage war with a large and very powerful army, but will not be able to stand because of the plots devised against him. Those who eat from the king's provisions will try to destroy him. So internal plots against him. His army will be swept away, and many will fall in battle. The two kings, I'm in verse 27, the two kings with their hearts bent on evil will sit at the same table and lie to each other, but to no avail. Yeah, there's a good description of political discourse. But to no avail, because an end will still come at the appointed time. The king of the north will return to his own country with great wealth, but his heart will be set against the holy covenant. He will take action against it and then return to his own country. So verses 25 through 28 talk about it's funny, I thought I had some notes about them sitting down and lying to each other, but I didn't. Right, so still talking about Antiochus IV, verse 28, the note there's interesting. In response to the intrigues in Jerusalem against his supporters, Antiochus IV plundered the temple when he returned from Egypt, Syrian Antioch. So he's crossing through Judea. Again, it's a land bridge going back and forth. And as he crosses through, he plunders the temple. I also read that he killed 80,000 people, 80,000 Jews when he came through. So
Is this when he put the pig in the temple?
I don't think so. I think it's
Okay.
still coming up.
Okay.
At the appointed time, he will invade the south again, but this time the outcome will be different from what it was before. Ships of the western coastlands will oppose him, and he will lose heart. Then he will turn back and vent his fury against the Holy Covenant. He will return and show favor to those who forsake the Holy Covenant. This is where he starts his campaign against Judaism, basically. Verse 31, his armed forces will rise up to desecrate the temple fortress and will abolish the daily sacrifice. They will set up the abomination that causes desolation. With flattery, he will corrupt those who have violated the covenant, but the people who know their God will firmly resist him. So we have three types of people being talked about. We have Antiochus and his troops who are putting pressure on the Jewish people to abandon their faith. And he's trying to exterminate the Jewish faith in lots of different ways. And his focus here on the temple and the activities in Jerusalem. And he's rewarding and showing favor to people who forsake the Jewish faith and who turn and oppose the worship of the one true God. Yeah. And so he's gathering around him. He's got his Syrian people who are assisting him, and then he's got traitors, apostates within the Jewish community who are also helping him. And there's a small group of Jewish people who are faithful. And these again are the Maccabees now. They're rising back up and they're faithful to their God, and they're going to resist him. God gives them a strong heart to resist him. And so we enter now into what's called the Maccabean period, where there's this struggle for the reinstitution of Jewish worship and the sacrificial system and all of that. That is the Maccabean period. And if you want to know about the Maccabean period, there's a lot of information, reliable information that you can go online and read, or you can just read about it in First and Second Maccabees, which are books from around that period of time that recount that and are deemed to be a good and accurate representation in most instances of what's going on there. So the people who know their God and will firmly resist Antiochus are still being spoken of in verse 33. Those who are wise will instruct many, though for a time they will fall by the sword or be burned or captured or plundered. Those who are wise will instruct many. So the Maccabeans were priests. Their father, the leader of the Maccabean clan, was a priest, and his sons were priests, and they were instructing, not only fighting with swords and things, but actually instructing their neighbors in the Jewish faith. And so those who are wise will instruct many. That's what this is about. But that they will be, many of them, for a time, will fall by the sword, be burned, captured, or plundered. When they fall, they will receive a little help, and many who are not sincere will join them. So we have this problem with apostate, deceiving Jewish people again, joining the ranks of the Maccabees and pretending to fight against the Syrian invasion here. Some of the wise will stumble, so that they may be refined, purified, and made spotless until the end, for it will still come at the appointed time. So with that, we end the Maccabean period, and also we're entering into a next period, which the Hasmonean period, where after Antiochus dies and that whole situation is over, we have kind of the reconstruction, the rebuilding back there, trying to reestablish the Jewish way of life, and that's the Hasmonean period. So we've come now, as you just noticed, we didn't spend a lot of time, but there are a lot of verses, there's a lot of space devoted to Antiochus IV. And this is because it's a very significant time and a very trying time for the Jewish people. And Jesus, I won't talk about that right now, but so if you were a Jewish person and you were living through this period of time, and as I mentioned last week, the last prophet to the people of Israel was Malachi, about 400 BC. But we are now at about 164 BC. That's when Antiochus desecrates the temple. So we're 240 years has passed, roughly. No prophet. But what they've got is this prophecy of Daniel 10 through 12. And what they've been able to see is that verses 1 through 1 through 20. They could see 1 through 20 were fulfilled already. They could look at their history and they could read the book of Daniel and go, that happened just the way it said it would. And there was no way they would have been able to read Daniel and then write it out beforehand, right? If you were living in Daniel's time, you couldn't figure it out. But after it happened, you can look back and go, I can see that clearly. This is what happened. And then Antiochus rises and they can see that also. The purpose of the prophecy, again, is so that they could be encouraged, so that they could look at what God had said and brought about. And God brought about exactly what he said. And even though they find themselves in an extremely difficult time of the Syrian invasion with Antiochus IV, they find themselves in this difficult time, they could still take comfort from the fact that God is the God of history. He controls all these events. and he's working out his good plan. And he has shown himself faithful, not just hundreds of years ago, but they could look at their own recent history and go, God has been faithful step by step to do what he said. And this encourages faith. This encourages faith and faithfulness. And that's the purpose of the prophecy of Daniel 11 so far. We read up to Daniel 11, verse 36. The first 35 verses are definitely about, historical events that are easy to read about and go, well, that's that. And if you were there living them, you would go, that's what Daniel said would happen. So it engenders faith. When we get to verse 36, we have a difficulty because it's been talking about Antiochus now for 15 verses. And so it looks like to some interpreters that what's happening is that Daniel's prophecy at this point is about what happens to the Syrian kings, that it's about Syria, because Antiochus was a Syrian king, and we've now just spent 15 verses on Syrian kings, and we didn't end with Antiochus' death. And so it's like, well, that story's not complete. Don't we have to find out what happened to Antiochus? So we get to verse 36, and people read this, verse 36, the king will do as he pleases. He will exalt and magnify himself above every god and will say unheard of things against the God of gods. He will be successful until the time of wrath is completed, for what has been determined must take place. He will show no regard for the gods of his fathers or for the one desired by women, nor will he regard any god, but will exalt himself above all. Instead of them, he will honor a god of fortresses, a god unknown to his fathers. He will honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and costly gifts. He will attack the mightiest fortresses with the help of a foreign god and will greatly honor those who acknowledge him. He will make them rulers over many people and will distribute the land at a price. And verse 40, at the time of the end, the king of the south will engage him in battle, and the king of the north will storm against him with chariots and cavalry and a great fleet of ships. So when people get to 1136, they've been reading about Antiochus, and so the natural assumption is they're still reading about Antiochus IV. So they get to 1136, the king will do as he pleases. Yeah, we know that. That's Antiochus. He will exalt and magnify himself above every god, blah, 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 right? All the extra stuff there. And they say, well, he doesn't fit. Antiochus IV doesn't fit this. This description of this king who's going to do as he pleases, that is not, it's not a description of Antiochus IV anymore. Something's happened. Now, I mentioned that critics of the Bible, and even sadly people within the church, say that the book of Daniel must be written in the Maccabean period because the history 1 through 35 is so accurate that nobody could have known that in advance. And it's at this point, at verse 36, where the higher critics and the people who believe Daniel was written late, they say, well, we know that Daniel was written during the Maccabean period because all the stuff, like I said, 1 through 35 is accurate, but 36 and forward is not accurate. And so Daniel was just guessing. He wrote this book somewhere between verses 35 and 36. I'm sure that you all agree that's just a really terrible way to approach the Bible. Yeah.
Well, can't they prove in history, Chuck, who this is? I mean, who Egypt fought against so hard with the chariots and all like that? I mean,
Yeah.
I see in Ben-Hur.
Ben-Hur, right. Well, see, Patsy, that's part of the difficulty. I think that a case can be made for that all of this is still continuing on in chronological order, and that these historical references refer to people and events that took place at that time, and so
Right.
they're in our past, and that's been the impulse of most of the earlier interpreters, although not all of them, they would read this and think, well, it's a historical narrative. It's continuing. I mean, it's continuing in a historical sequence. We've had 240 years in historical sequence, 35 verses in historical sequence. So verse 36 should be somewhere around there, should be next in line. And so what we have then is people who I said try to make this fit Antiochus or any Syrian descendants, and it doesn't fit. They try to make it fit a Roman general or emperor or Caesar, doesn't fit. And they for the most part have not looked at some other clues in the text that might give help. And when they don't, so if you're only looking for Syrian successors or Roman successors, you're not going to find them. And so then what happens is that people start looking elsewhere. And then this is where we get the idea that we're skipping 2,000 plus years to get to the future Antichrist. There's a passage in chapter 12 that also might encourage people to do that. And I'll show you that passage. And when we get there, we'll talk about it. If you look at chapter 12, verse 1, it's actually, it's verses 1 and 2. At that time, Michael, the great prince who protects your people, so your people is Daniel's people, the Jewish people. At that time, Michael, the great prince who protects your people, will arise. There will be a time of distress, such as not happened from the beginning of nations until then. But at that time, your people, everyone whose name is found written in the book, will be delivered. Multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt. Those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the heavens, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. But you, Daniel, close up and seal the words of the scroll until the time of the end. Many will go here and there to increase knowledge. That's the end of the vision. And then Daniel asks a couple of questions about it that are in the postscript there. But verse 2, multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt. Is that confusing? Many people, many people read that and immediately think of the general resurrection of all people at the end of history. And we'll talk about it more when we get there. But obviously, if that's the general resurrection at the end of history, then it is a legitimate move to go to the end of history somewhere in this vision. That's a legitimate move. So when we get there, we'll talk about whether or not that there's enough there to say conclusively whether or not it's the final judgment at the end of history.
What have you got? Give me that.
But so anyway, so the idea that we're skipping ahead is supported in many people's views by the verse I just read.
Okay.
So it's some of the interpreters that I've read don't appeal to chapter 12, verse 2 to support their view that they're skipping ahead, but I think it must be formative, right? It's got to be formative. If you think that's the final judgment, then of course you've obviously skipped ahead. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. So we have two groups of interpreters, groups of verse 36, groups that believe that we're skipping ahead to the final Antichrist, or groups that believe that there's some contemporary with, historically in line with verses 1 through 35, that the next thing chronologically. Among the groups that think there's the next thing chronologically, you have people who think, as I said, that it's non-Jewish person. That's a large group of those interpreters, or a Jewish person. So we're going to divide it there. Now, I think it's a Jewish person, and there are some interpreters in church history who have thought this, and what I'm going to be presenting to you is that I think the case can be made that this is actually Herod the Great being spoken of in verses 36 through 39. And you have to make up your mind about that, whether there's sufficient reason to think that. Ultimately, it's only important as we're dealing with, for our purposes of studying Revelation, it's only important as we're dealing with the passage that is echoed in Revelation 10. And that passage was was Daniel 12, 5 through 7, or 5 through 9. So I'll read that real quick. So again, this is the postscript. Then I, Daniel, looked, and there before me stood two others, one on this side of the river and one on the opposite bank. So talking about angels. One of them said to the man, another angel clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, how long will it be before these astonishing things are fulfilled? The man clothed in linen who was above the waters of the river lifted his right hand and his left hand toward heaven. This is what's echoed in Revelation. And I heard him swear by him who lives forever, saying, it will be for a time, times, and half a time. When the power of the holy people has been finally broken, all these things will be completed. I heard, but I did not understand. So I asked my Lord, what will the outcome of all this be? And then tells him to go away, go his own way. So verse 7, the angel lifts his hand and swears by him who lives forever, saying it will be for a time, times, and half a time, which is not particularly helpful because that's one of those designations of time which there's wild disagreement about. But thankfully, we have the thankfully we have a synonymous explanation, which is when the power of the holy people has finally been broken, all these things will be completed. So this is echoed in the Revelation when the angel raises both hands. The mighty angel with one leg on the land and one on the sea, raises both hands, swears to God who lives forever, who created heaven and earth, that in the days preceding the blowing of the seventh trumpet, the mystery of God will be complete. So we have an echo of this passage that I just read in Daniel 12. So
Check which verse were you on in Revelation there?
So that was Revelation 10,
10.
7.
Thank you.
10,
Okay,
7.
thank you.
Might be 5 through 7. I was just doing it from memory.
Okay.
So what we're trying to do is see what the relationship is between the two verses, because Revelation is echoing the Daniel passage. So our final goal is to try to figure that out. But to do that, we have to go through the prophecy of Daniel 10 through 12 and figure out what's going on in verse 36, or at least talk about the options. And so now we've got to that point. Now, I just wanted to offer the reasons why this is no longer talking about a Syrian king. And it's talking about a Jewish king in verse 36, or at least the reasons why it might be thought that could be that support the idea that it might be talking about a Jewish king. I guess I'll say it like that. The first thing is that we have the purpose of the prophecy, chapter 10, verse 14, which we read earlier, which was to tell Daniel and Daniel's people what would befall them in the latter days. Now, we might take the phrase latter days and want to jump that to the end of time, but the way latter days is defined in the Bible, and you can see it really clearly here without me going to any other passages, is the time after the exile. That's what it means. If this prophecy was about the end of history, why would it start in verse 11:2 with the Persian period and then go blow by blow for 240 years? If we're talking about the end of history, if the subject of the prophecy is the end of history, the latter days. Now, what it means is the post-exilic period. It starts with the Persian kings, goes through Alexander the Great, goes through the Syrian and Egyptian wars. It's going to talk about some of the Roman generals and the rise of Rome, and it's going to end up, and it goes through the Maccabean period. So we've had the Jews being reintroduced here. It's going to end up right around the 1st century. And so we have we have 10:14 that says it's about the Jewish people. So this is not about expressly, this is not about the Syrian kings. When we run into, when we get to verse 36 and we start looking around for a Syrian king and we can't find one that fits, we should stop looking for a Syrian king. It's not about Syria. It doesn't matter if Antiochus doesn't die, in Daniel 11, because he's not important. The thing that's important is what's happening to the Jewish people. So it's not about Syrian kings or even Roman kings. The second thing it says the king will do as he pleases. Every other king we've run into is qualified, has some kind of descriptive qualifier. King of the south, king of the north, etc., like that. This king has no qualifier, and he's not the king of the south, and he's not the king of the north. You can see that when we get to verse 40. He's just the king. The king. Now, which king, what country would this king be over if you're Jewish and I say the king?
Israel.
Right. That
Right.
seems like a no-brainer. Right.
Mhm.
So that would be a king, a Jewish king, or a king over Judea, over Israel, over the Holy Land, however you want to say it, over the glorious land, as it's called here. So we have a prophecy about the fate of the Jewish people, what's going to befall them during this period of the latter days. So let me say one other thing about the latter days, and I think we'll have time to look at some verses in just a minute about them. But so there were another thing about the latter days. They're the last days before the Messiah comes. The latter days. The big event on the horizon for the Old Testament people was the coming of the Messiah, not the end of history. Okay, the big event for those people was the coming of the Messiah. The big event for us is the end of history, but the big event for them is the coming of the Messiah. When they say the latter days, they mean those days right before the coming of the Messiah. So this is that. I guess that's probably even the easiest way to understand it. So. So having said that, let me look at a couple of verses. Let's look at a couple of verses that actually will also show that latter days is also used for the post-exilic period, for the period after the exile. If you look at Zechariah 1:4, let's see. Do not be like your forefathers, to whom the earlier prophets or the former prophets proclaimed. This is what the Lord Almighty says: turn from your evil ways and your evil practice. But they would not listen or pay attention to me, declares the Lord. This passage talks about the earlier or the former prophets. Those are the prophets before the exile. And I think if you have a study Bible, if you look at your note, it'll say that the former prophets are the prophets before the exile. The ESV note actually goes on to say, therefore, the latter prophets are the prophets after the exile. But so the former prophets are the ones before the exile. If you look at Zechariah 7:7, let's see that also 7:12. 7:7. Are these not the words the Lord proclaimed through the former prophets when Jerusalem and its surrounding towns were at rest and prosperous, and the Negev and the western foothills were settled? And then 7:12, 7:11, we'll go there. They refused to pay attention. Stubbornly, they turned their backs and stopped up their ears. They made their hearts as hard as flint and would not listen to the law or to the words that the Lord Almighty had sent by his Spirit through the earlier prophets. So the Lord Almighty was very angry through the former prophets. And then 8:11. But now I will not deal with the remnant of this people as I did in the... Am I in the right place? Sorry, as I did in the past, as I did formerly. Oh, I'm really sorry. That is not the right reference. Okay. Well, that was my last reference. I will have to find that for you. Anyway, the Bible talks about the earlier prophets as the ones being the ones pre-exilic. Latter would be after. And sorry about that. Sorry about not having the right reference there. That's not good. So we have, let's go back to Daniel 11. So two reasons why you might think that this is a Jewish king is that it just has the king, no designation, and that would naturally be interpreted as the Jewish king, and that also this is about the Jewish people. It's been suggested by several interpreters, by no means the majority, a small minority of interpreters throughout history. We have 2nd century, Middle Ages, 19th century, 20th century, and even now, we have people suggesting that perhaps this is Herod the Great. And the reason they think it's Herod the Great is because it seems like he fits what's being said here really, really well. So let's see what we have. Verse 36, the king will do as he pleases. One of the things that really marked Herod was his success. He had great success in rising to power. If you read the history of Herod, he was always looking for the way, the advantage, any advantage he could have in ingratiating himself to powerful people so that they could bring him up with them. And when you read about the political affiliations that Herod had, he switches alliances back and forth. I mean, he will betray people that he's been in alliance with because it looks like they're losing ground politically. So he'll switch sides so he'd be on the winning side at the end. And he did this multiple times during his career. He was very, very successful in understanding the political climate of his day and the things that people valued, the leaders. And so he was really, really good. So and when you read about Herod, even when you read articles that are critical of Herod, which is all of them,
Yeah.
because he was a terrible person. In fact, the article at the Jewish Virtual Library ends with the sentence, even though he was a terrible king and a terrible person. They said he built lots of buildings and fortresses and things that people still come and see. Tourists come. So he's good for the economy. But one of the things that this passage, this description of this king, we'll just keep reading. He will exalt and magnify himself above every god and will say unheard of things against the God of gods. So he's speaking against the Jewish God. And Herod was very ungodly in all of his dealings and all of his relationships. The Jewish people hated him because they saw him basically, he was the face of Rome. They didn't even consider him to be one of them. And he was from Edom, but he had converted to Judaism. He was forced to convert. And he did know the Bible. He knew the Old Testament. And in a lot of his public speeches, he would quote it and he would sound like a good Israelite, but he was only doing that politically, right? So he would try to gain favor.
So he did convert to Judaism?
He did. Yeah,
okay.
He did. It was forced conversion of him and his family when he was younger. I mean, he did some things like he plundered David's tomb so that he could take the stuff he found there and give it to the Roman general so that he would be ingratiated to the general.
Oh my
This
goodness.
guy is so anti-Jewish. I mean, can you imagine a worse thing? I can't even imagine a worse thing than that. So He plunders David's tomb. So he exalts himself. He says ridiculous, unheard of things against the God of gods. And even in his public speeches where he's talking about, where he sounds biblical, it's just blasphemous because it's coming out of his mouth. It's blasphemous. He will be successful until the time of wrath is completed. This means that the time of that's being covered in the prophecy is time of wrath. It ends with the breaking of the power of the scattering of the power of the Jewish people, as we read in chapter 12. For what has been determined must take place. He will show no regard for the gods of his fathers. Now, my ESV says gods of his fathers, but I think that King James says, and probably does the, do any translations there in verse 37 say, show no regard for the God of his father? God of his fathers. Nobody's got that. Shirley?
Mhm.
Do you have
Yeah,
God or?
I got neither shall he regard the God of his fathers. That's what I've got.
The God of his fathers, right? Yeah. So this is the word there. The Hebrew word is can be translated either God or gods. And some of the older translations said God because they recognized or they thought this is a Jewish king, right? Because to not recognize the God of your father, that would be, or of your fathers, that's a phrase that's used to Jewish people, not of pagans. Pagans have many gods, many gods.
Mine says gods.
Yeah, gods, right.
Uh-huh.
It's the same word. It can be translated God or gods. And in fact, obviously in the Bible, it's translated God or gods. The word that we read when we read about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that word, God, it's exactly this word. But it's also the same word that when you read about the gods of the nations, it's this word. It's either translated singular or plural, depending on what you think the context is. So some older translations, King James and ones based on the King James, translate it God, and that makes sense if we're talking about a Jewish king. Gods makes sense if we're talking about a Syrian king or some other king. Even now, here's an interesting thing. Classic dispensationalism teaches about future Antichrist that he's going to be Jewish, and they're among the group that takes these verses 36 through 39 and projects them into the future, 2,000 years. And so that view would also require that this word be translated God instead of gods. So that's
Can I ask a question?
yes.
If you said he was from Edom, didn't they have a lot of gods? Could
I
that
don't
be the
know.
gods
I
of
don't,
his fathers from
no,
Edom?
I don't think
No?
so. They were
Okay.
still children of Abraham.
Okay,
The Edomites are children of Abraham.
okay.
So then it goes on and says, he'll show no regard for the God or gods of his fathers, or for the one desired by women, nor will he regard any God, but will exalt himself above all. So this phrase, he'll show no regard, or for the one desired by women. He'll show no regard for the one desired by women. Sometimes interpreters have thought this means that he's not attracted to women. He's perhaps homosexual or something like that. I don't think that means that at all. And many interpreters, even ones that don't think it's Herod, would go back to, say, Haggai 2:7. Let's look at Haggai 2:7 real quick, and then I'll give an explanation, and then I think we'll be out of time. So Haggai is to the right. It's one of the 12 books toward the end. It's between the two Z's, Zephaniah and Zechariah.
Your genie, Patsy.
Verse 6, this is what the Lord Almighty says. You guys there? No,
2:6.
Yeah, 2:6, Haggai 2:6. This is what the Lord Almighty says. In a little while I will once more shake the heavens and the earth, the sea and the dry land. I will shake all nations, and the desired of all nations will come, and I will fill this house with glory, says the Lord Almighty. The desired of all nations. It's a title for the Messiah, the desired of all nations. Connie, you're on mute. Sorry.
Mine is not saying desire of nations in Haggai. What translation are you using?
I have the NIV in front of me. What are you using? Oh, New American Standard. What does it say?
Yeah.
Oh, does it say the treasures?
The wealth of all nations.
Yeah, that's generally thought, even though the New American Standard is an excellent translation, that's generally thought to be a pretty poor translation there.
Mine says all the treasures of
Yeah,
all the
treasures
nations.
and wealth. It's that because what they're translating it as, I mean, they're going, what are the things that the nations desire? Oh, it's wealth. But so you can look at it, I guess, either way. But the historically, this has been understood to be a messianic prophecy. Yes.
And King James does say desire of all nations.
Right. Yeah, and that I think is the majority, has been the majority translation, the desire of all nations. So referring to a person. So what you have here is generally commentators will link what we read in Daniel 11 about not desiring the one desired by women. That's linked with Haggai 2:7. The same word is being used. It's linked with Haggai 2:7, and the thought is there. And then a further link to Matthew chapter 2, where Herod tries to kill the Messiah, knowing that it's the Messiah. Herod knows that Jesus is the Messiah. They tell him, this is the King of the Jews. He's been born. Where is he? And they look in the scripture, and Herod then sends to kill him. So the passages linked with this passage are, this is a messianic reference, and the fact that Herod showed no regard for him is clearly seen in Herod trying to kill him. So I think, yeah, that's a good link there. Nor will he regard any god, but will exalt himself above them all. Herod was, he had no god, really. He was atheistic in his life. His god was himself. He was living for self-promotion. Instead of them, he will honor a god of fortresses, a god unknown to his fathers. He will honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and costly gifts. When you read about Herod, one of the things he was known for, he's known for a couple of things. He's known for his success in everything he undertook in his political rise, his success. He did whatever he would. He's known for his viciousness and his, he not only, trying to kill the Messiah and ending up killing the babies in Bethlehem. That's a terrible thing, but it isn't unique. It's not surprising when you read the reign of Herod. You can get a summary at the article from the Jewish Virtual Library. It basically says Herod killed everyone he suspected of conspiring against him. His wife, his kids, everyone. On his death, he left instructions to kill 80 of the Jewish leaders. He was just, he's a vicious person. So this is always commented on. And the third thing that's always commented on with Herod is that he loved to build fortresses. He loved to build fortresses. And in fact, that's the main point of the article on the Jewish Virtual Library. They go through all the fortresses, not all of them, but they go through many of the fortresses that Herod built, and then they talk about how good he was for tourism. Now, and they also say that he built those fortresses to ingratiate himself and raise money for Rome. So So he builds these fortresses. He names them Roman names. He builds the town of Caesarea, which is Caesar. He's continually honoring the Romans so he can so he can get more power, more authority, continually honoring them. And he's taking money from the Jewish people. I already mentioned plundering the tomb of David, but he has several other instances where he's taking money from the Jewish people, giving it to the Romans so that he can extend his power, extend his reach. So he honors the god of fortresses, the Romans, with gold and silver, with costly gifts. And then verse 39, yeah.
What does it mean that he had help with the help of a foreign god? What does that mean?
Yeah, the Romans, I think.
Okay.
He will attack the mightiest fortresses with the help of a foreign god and will greatly honor those who acknowledge him. He will make them rulers over many people and will distribute land at a price. This is something that most rulers do, right? This last part is that the people that support them, they reward them by giving them things. And this is no different with Herod. But the things Herod is marked for particularly are that he did as he wanted. He was successful, rose quickly. He was vicious and against anybody who opposed him and was trying to threaten his kingship. And so we see an example of that with his slaughter of the innocents, but that was the same all through his career. And then the third thing is that he built fortresses to ingratiate himself to the Romans. And so when we read the description of him, of this person in verse 36 to 39, there's nothing in there that doesn't fit Herod. And so then if it is Herod, then we have, it also fits chronologically, and we don't skip ahead. And, we'll see how the rest of the chapter plays out and where it takes us, but so we're just exploring right now, could this possibly be Herod? And because we want to make sure that we're staying within the parameters of the prophecy, latter days, Jewish people's history, ending with the scattering of the Jewish power. So that's where we are today. So hopefully I'm sure it was clearer than the last time. And we're at, yes, Mom.
So I wasn't here for the last one, and I haven't watched the video, but is the ultimate goal of studying Daniel to show how it lines up with the same time period that Revelation is talking about?
That's what I'm exploring. I think that would be my personal view, is like that's my conclusion, but I want to make sure that I present it to you so you can critique that and evaluate it yourself. But yeah, I think that they're talking about, I think there's a lot of reasons to think that this is one of the more obscure reasons, but yeah, I think Daniel and Revelation are in particular talking about that period where the latter days ends and the Messiah has come. So, yeah. All right, anybody else have any comments before we close?